GIS is a great analysis tool. You can essentially feed it criteria in terms of data and questions and have it reveal to you an answer. For example, in site selection, you might be somewhat site selection agnostic and you just want to know what the best site is. Well, oftentimes you can use GIS to give you that answer. Other times you might just have a gut feeling like a certain site is good for something and you want to do some analysis to back it up based off of existing case studies and existing conditions. And that's what I'll be doing today. I'll go over a little scenario and show you a few methods that you can do to essentially get that type of validation. And the example I'm going to use is an Apple store. You could use really anything, a Trader Joe's, a ski club, a golf course, a frisbee golf course, etc. You can really use this method for anything. The data is out there. Oftentimes it'll be smaller than this. I'll be working at a national scale. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right in. So I've got ArcMAP open. I'll start with a new blank map. I'll go through a few good practices when you're just working on your own computer. And by that I mean setting up your folder and file structure. So I'll use my desktop. I like to use my desktop. I'm going to create a new folder and I'll call this Apple Store Study. Go back and save my document. Save early, save often. I'll talk about a few ways that your data is saved when you're generating new geo processes and etc. So more on that later, but still you'll want to save early, save often. The name doesn't matter a whole lot here, just name it something that makes sense. So that's a really good start. Get in the habit of doing that. The next thing I'd recommend is make a folder connection. Now, one thing you'll notice, unless you're really structured in how you manage files on your computer, you may end up with a few folder connections that don't exist. Now, for example, I had one called Apple Study. Is that what I named this one? So I changed this one to Apple Store Study. If I tried to open this, oh, I get a little red. Nope. That just means that folder has moved. It's not there anymore. And I got to do some cleanup. So I will right click and disconnect folder. I like to keep this somewhat clean, so I'll get rid of those other ones and connect to that one that I just created. Now, this is a common thing to do if you're doing what I'm doing, just doing a bunch of little exercises and I'm moving things around a lot. In a much larger, more structured environment, you would want to probably, just for good practice, keep that somewhat organized and consistent. So we've got our folder set up. I can see my file in here that I just saved. Next recommendation is to create a geo database. And you know what? Sometimes this happens. Like you might say, oh, I want to right click and do new. Oh, nope, just kidding. You can't do that. You know, I'm not sure why it does that, but here's the fix. Restart ArcMAP. You'd be surprised how many problems can be solved by restarting your application or restarting your computer. I always recommend that as a first step. All right, now it's showing me my recent documents. Let's see what happens if I open it up, go to that same folder, and problem solved. You maybe saw yours from the start. If you didn't, like I did, you'd want to go through those steps. Right click, new file geodatabase. Again, just name it something logical. So I got apple gdb.gdb. The .gdb is the extension, and that just creates a directory. Not quite done. Now you want to right click and make default geodatabase. All right, so I'm set to start adding some things and crunching some numbers. Well, there's a complex way to do this and maybe an overly simple way. I'm trying to find the minimally effective dose here where I can make my case. So I'm just going to look at households and demographic data in terms of population and see if Fargo could support an Apple store based off of where they decide to put all of their other Apple stores. And where do we find that criteria? Well, I could do a bunch of research, or I could just go to Apple's website and somewhere on there it says over 90% of the nation's population is within 15 minutes of an Apple store. Unfortunately, we are in the 10% that is not. But if you deconstruct that, you could say, well, 15 minutes, that's probably 10 miles, 10-mile drive, that sounds about right. So I'm going to create a series of buffers that are 10 miles. Now, there's a lot of areas of the country that people have multiple Apple stores within 10 miles. So I'll be creating some clusters. And in the end, I'll eventually find a number that is people per Apple store. And that's what I'll be showing. Now, if I were to take this further, I could start looking at number of homeowners. I could start looking at average wages, etc. There's really no end to the data that we can plug in, but keep in mind this is just for an example, not the absolute correct way to do it, but it's one of many. And you'll see it makes a fairly, hopefully, convincing case. Where do we get data? Well, the answer is wherever you can find it. GIS is all over the place. And honestly, before I jumped into here and add data from ArcGIS Online, let me show you another way. Before they added that feature in I think 10.1 or 10.2, oftentimes you just had to Google it. And you know, what would you Google? Kind of the magic words to string together are data, GIS, download, shapefile, and then put in what you're looking for. So census data, and maybe I want tracked files. So if you punch in something like that, you'll find websites where you can get a lot of the same data. Let's try another one. Let's try Boulder property. There we go, some data from Boulder. Maybe I want oil well Bakken. You get the idea. Sometimes you got to dig. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier, but you know that's one way. And then there's a handful of sources such as the USGS Earth Explorer, and there's one called National Atlas, so National Atlas Data Download. Short answer is the stuff is out there, so if you cannot find it through here, just keep in mind of that. Let's jump in. Well, what do I want to work with? How about Household Census data? Let's see what we can find. Keep in mind, a lot of the results here will be map services, meaning you can only really look at it and use it for supporting your thoughts in a presentational manner, but you can't really crunch them into other things. But this one you can. So you want to find this file, USA Household by Census block. And this data is dynamic. It changes. Hopefully this piece is still here if you are following along with this exercise. Because this is the first piece of data that I'm adding to my document, my frame is going to inherit its default coordinate system. So it's kind of this squishy coordinate system. Don't worry too much about that right now. And in general, even if you want to change to something else, such as the auxiliary sphere, which looks more like a map, I'd recommend waiting to do that until you're ready to present this data. Here's the other interesting thing. This is a lot of data. I think there's over 6 million records in this file, and you can see it's even taking my computer a little bit of time to crunch it. Now, I'm recording this on a MacBook Air using Parallels virtualization. Hopefully, your machine is a desktop powerhouse with a bunch of RAM, and it'll be faster than what mine is. But if I can do it on my machine, you should be able to do it on yours. Well, let's see. Do we wait for this thing to load? I guess I don't really have a choice. I didn't really prepare anything to fill this space with. Maybe I'll edit it out. Maybe I won't. It looks like it's about done. Can I add some more data while I'm waiting? Sure, why not? So I'm going to go back to ArcGIS Online from the Add Data button. And this time let's do Apple stores. Very conveniently, there are Apple stores data. I recommend vetting this data a little bit. Don't take everything that you find here as 100% accurate. One thing that's a red flag is this is from 4/16 of 2013. They've probably added a few more. So for the sake of this exercise, I will assume that's accurate. But if I was really doing a formal study, I would want to jump in here and fill in the blanks. If you click on details, you can see who created this. And this one does not have a description. It's got some properties, no comments. So right away, you know, I'm taking some liberties here and assuming this is correct. In a real formal study, once again, I would probably vet this a little bit more accurately. But let's just pretend it's good. Go ahead and add it. And we should see these show up. This USA Households by Census block, all you really need to know is that you're going to do something with it. You don't need to have it visible. So I'm going to turn that off, and I can see these points are representing Apple Store locations. If I was to add an outline of the country, you'd see Alaska up here. I think that's Hawaii, and you can kind of get a sense of the country. I could add some base map information, but I won't right now. Also keep in mind, this is just point data. These dots, look like they're covering many miles of space relative to the map, but they are not relative to the map. They are relative to your screen. So as I zoom in, the dot sizes are that exact same size. Let's right click and zoom to layer, bring that back. Well, what's the next thing we'd want to do? Maybe we want to add some census tract information. This census data that we did add is block information, but it's purely points. It's no outlines. Let's go ahead and see what some tract information might look like. Also keep in mind, census data is available at multiple levels. There's a census group, a census tract, and then a block group in that order, and a block group is the most accurate. I think I've got that backwards. I need a second to access the part of my brain that remembers that, and I believe it's census tract is the higher level, block group is the next one, and then census blocks. So that's the order. Just know that there is an order. I do want to search for census tract. Let's see what we find. We get a lot of data that includes the census tract, and I believe I want this one, USA Census Tract Boundaries. I will go ahead and add that, and we'll see that it's just what it sounds like. It is boundaries. Here's a neat thing about census data. There's usually much more included with the data than what is in the title. This is not only just tract boundaries. If I were to right click and open the attribute table, I can see I've got my FIPS variables, I've got demographic data, I've got race data, population, age, all kinds of really neat stuff. Renter occupied, owner occupied. How do we know what all of these attributes mean? Well, we could right click and go to data and view item description. You might think you'd go to properties, but this is where we can see the description. And if this stuff was created fairly accurately and in a good practice, you should see all kinds of really good information here. And if I zoom down, scroll down, eventually I'll find the attributes as well as a description of what those are. Now, I'm going to bet some of you are this far and you don't see this information. For those of you who do see it, just ignore this next part. If you don't see all this wonderful information, here's what you want to do. You would want to go to, I believe, Customize and ArcMAP Options. Make sure your metadata tab is set to the FGDC, which is Federal Geographic Data Consortium, something standard. That's the one you'd want. Then the item description will display more information. All right, let's jump back into it. We've got tract boundary. Let's go ahead and zoom into close to around where Fargo is. That's up here. That's where I'm currently recording this. It's that little detached suburb from Minneapolis. It's floated away many years ago. Moorhead on the right, of course. And if I turn on now my USA Household Census block and zoom in even more, you can start understanding how this data is compiled and represented. In this tract, there are this many census block households. And there's another one in between, the block group, which would be a further division. And if I were to get info, I'll click my identity button, and I will click on this shape here, making sure to stay away from a dot. This is another way to see all of those same attributes and get a sense of what you can and cannot do with this data. So that particular item, if I see, population 2010, I can see that there are 4,987 census recorded people who live in there. This one happens to have a population 2012, which is an extrapolation of the actual census. So I can see that this place is expected to have a higher population. So you can start mapping change. We won't be doing that. Let's close this. Info button again. oh, let's click on one of these dots instead. So this now I'm querying the USA household data that I added right away, and I accidentally got rid of my table of contents. Let's bring that back, put that over here, and try that one more time. There we go. Identify. I don't know why my identify is kind of sticking to the side like that, but oh well, that's all right. So here's my attributes, and this also has a population. So that particular group only has 51 people in it. If I were to add up all of these, I would get the same number that I had for this because it's all census data, and the math works out because government is full of mathematicians. Now, at this point, you need to question, well, is the block group data or the track group data what I want? And maybe you want both, maybe you want one or the other. In this example, I will just be working with the census block data. And the reason is I'll be creating buffers, and sometimes those buffers will cut right through a tract. Well, what happens then? Do you take the population of that tract and equally balance it based off of the percentage of the tract that you're overlapping? You could do that, but it would be more accurate if I just included the block groups. Just trust me on that. You know what? Let me bring back my table of contents. And I'm going to keep this tract boundary, but I'll just turn it off for now. And the household by census block, yeah, let's turn that off as well. And let's zoom to the Apple Store layer. So right click, oops, it's in a group, so right click there, zoom to layer. Now, I'm going to assume that if there was an Apple Store in Fargo, would it conform demographically to all these other ones? Because that would be a good argument point. You could say, hey, Apple, look, Fargo is not any different than the rest of the world. So, how about you put a store here? Going back to what I was first talking about with the distances, and I'm just kind of assuming that 10 miles is a good unit of measurement because 10 miles, roughly equals maybe a 15-minute commute. So I want to go in and buffer each one of these. But at this point, I always want to get in the habit of thinking a couple steps ahead. I'm going to buffer these, and then I'm going to clip the census block data, which it takes a while. You'll want to tee up something to keep you busy while that's happening. And then I want to go back and buffer a theoretical or a proposed location in Fargo, and then I'll need to go back and clip these again. Well, do I want to clip them twice or do I want to clip them once? I want to clip them once. So in this scenario, I'm going to add my proposed Apple Store location to the conveniently existing Apple Store data that I got from the ArcGIS online. But I've mentioned this before as well, a weird little thing. Depending on where this data is saved, you may or may not be able to edit the file. And on my computer, it might work for yours, but on my computer, I can see that it's accessing this data. It looks like it's actually accessing it on a server. That would explain why I cannot edit it. Sometimes you can see it's on a server and you can't even copy it. In this situation, I can. So here's what I'll do. Before I buffer this, I'm going to right click on that apple, go to data, and I'm going to export it. Where do I want to export it to? Hopefully, well, it would make sense to put it inside of that Geo database that I created on step 1. If you did not set that to be your default Geo database, this will say default.gdb, and you want to rewind and watch how I did that. If I wanted to take this data into something else like Google Earth, I would want to save it outside of a Geo database. So that's another story. I'll just assume that it's in here. Also, get in the habit of naming these something logical and short, because GIS likes short names, and you will end up with a ton of files that you kind of want a nugget of detail so you can understand what it's about. I will go ahead and click OK. Output name is not valid. Oh, that's no good. Let's go ahead into this folder and see what happens if I navigate to that store or that location, my Geo database, file and personal Geo database. Is there any spaces in here? Why ain't you liking that, ArcGIS? Oh, there we go. I might have had the wrong profile, or it might be looking at a previous Geo database that I had moved. So sometimes you just gotta click that little folder icon. and go through the steps that I just did. So do I want to add this? Sure, let's add this. Notice it is an unstyled. Styled by nature is not tied to the data. This is just style agnostic. It's a dot, and that happens to be the default dot. If I wanted these to be a red dot, I could click on here and change it to a red dot, and problem solved. There's a couple other ways to do that that I'll show you later on, so stay tuned. But you know what? I can turn this one off, and I can actually right click and remove it because I don't need it anymore. But I do need to do that little copy step in order to edit this and add my proposed location. And if I right click, open the attribute table, I can still see that it is all the same as before. All right, so we need to find Fargo again. Well, how do we do that? I could turn on my track boundaries. Let's zoom in. Or maybe you're following these same steps with a different area. You just got to know where it is at. And I believe it's right up here. Let's zoom in some more. Do I want to plop this in the middle of this block group or put it somewhere where I'd actually want to put it? Well, I want to put it somewhere very specific. So that I'm going to need more information. So temporarily, I'm going to add a base map. For whatever reason on my computer, it gets really picky when I add a base map. I don't know if it's because I'm using parallels or what the story is, but I'll cross my fingers and see if this works. May or may not work. Sometimes weird things like this happen. Sometimes I just gotta wait. There it goes, right as I was drinking and enjoying some water. So if you've got issues with those base maps, you know, just keep that in mind. You might need to wait a little while. Whoops, oh, I didn't want to do that. That was bad news because now I'm kind of in the middle of nowhere. Is there a previous, scene view or an undo? Nope, I don't want to do that. I got to go back the hard way here. So I'm going to turn that off just because it's easier to find it this way. And you know what? That happens. You know, sometimes you just get a little disoriented where you are, and I need to zoom out and zoom back in and wait. There we go. Let's zoom tool, find my location once more, and I'll turn on my base map again. All right, so I'm proposing, because my gut tells me it would be a cool idea, that an Apple store go right downtown. Downtown is booming and all kinds of things. There's talk about doing some really fun stuff with this US Bank Plaza. How about we put an Apple store right there? All right, making one dot in any other program would be really easy. Not so easy in ArcMAP. You have a few options, and quickly the options are right click on your Geo database, new, and shapefile or feature dataset or feature class actually, and you give it some attributes and style and you plop it in here. You could also create this in Google Earth. I could go to Google Earth, make a place mark, and import that. That's kind of easy. It's kind of a dirty way to do it, but it works. Or I can edit an existing dataset, and this is why I made that copy, because I wouldn't be allowed to edit it, at least on my computer, by some weird reason. Maybe you can. And we'll just add another one here and add any necessary fields to delineate if it's an existing or a proposed site. So also this is how you would add a few stores. Maybe that data is out of date and there's 3 or 4 more stores. You would do these same steps that I'm doing now. So I will right click, start editing. That brings up your editor toolbar. And on the right side of this, there's an icon for create features. Click that. You'll see the different features as they have been symbolized in your layer over here. Highlight that, and down here I will click on point. And in what little real estate I've got left, I can still see my plaza. I'm gonna say, how about right, boom, right there. Then editor, stop editing. Do you want to save? Yeah, sure I do. And I will reclaim some real estate. Now I've got my dot. If I right click, zoom to layer, whoops, I don't want to, that actually makes sense here. I'm going to turn off this base map just because, again, the base map gets a little weird and I don't need that. All I really want to see is the Apple Store locations, and oh, there it is, Fargo. All right, now's a good time to save. Actually, 5 minutes ago was a good time to save. But if your ArcMAP were to ever crash, what's nice about this is at least the Apple export. Because I saved that in my Geo database and I know where it is at, it's really easy to add. So let's say this were to crash and I didn't just save it. Well, I can make a new file, go to my catalog, and open up my Geo database. And because I named it something that makes sense, I could just plop, drag it over here. This stuff, not so much, because that got saved to this documents, GIS packages, blah, blah, blah. I'd have to remember where that was at or copy it the same way I copied the Apple data. But we won't do that right now. All right, what's the next step? Create a buffer, 10 miles, as previously talked about. So geo processing, buffer. What am I going to buffer? Oh, hey, speak of crashing, sometimes this happens. Let's give it a second and see if it kicks out. I'm not going to get my hopes up. And welcome to the realities of working with computers and GIS in particular. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Might take a couple times. Hey, how about you go away? Nah, close the program. Well, that was good timing. I just saved it. Let's see here. Apple, double click. It's kind of ironic too that I'm using Windows to do this because ArcMAP is only available on Windows machines, which, you know, it's not too big of a deal, because thankfully there's things like parallels. All right, back to where we started. Let's just say I didn't save this, you know, that's gone. And darn, how do I get it back? Do I need to recreate it? Nope, I can just open up my Geo database and drag and drop. Boom, back to where I started. All right, let's try that buffer one more time. Geo processing, buffer, and we're in business. I'm going to buffer that feature set, Apple export. What's the output feature class? Well, here's where we start getting a lot of files really quick. I'll keep this in the Geo database, and I'm going to say AB_1, Apple buffer 1, because I kind of got a hunch I'm going to need to do this maybe once or twice. The linear unit will be 10, not feet, I was about to say feet, 10 miles. All right, there we go. Don't worry about all this other stuff right now. The defaults are good. I talked about these in a separate video. I will go ahead and just leave those as they are. Hit OK and see what happens. Looks like it's done. I don't really see them because this symbology over here is larger than my buffered areas. Let's zoom in on a cluster over here. Look at that. So what does this mean? Well, I've identified a cluster where every Apple store in this cluster is no more than 10 miles from another Apple store. And that could be helpful when I'm crunching some other information in a few minutes. So what's the next step? I need to do a dissolve. So I'm going to Geo Process, dissolve. What do I want to dissolve? Well, that thing that I just created, Apple buffer 1. And I'll call this Apple buffer AB_D. Again, this is just for your benefit because you're going to get a lot of these files, and down the road you might be like, if it's all export output 1, export output 2, it gets a little confusing. The defaults I will leave. Very important, deselect this, create multi-part feature. What does that mean? It's kind of opposite of what you would think. If you do create a multi-part feature, it means that one record in your feature class will contain multiple parts, and this will just give us one record. I want a bunch of records. I want each thing to be its own line item over here. So you do want to deselect that. Let's hit OK, see what happens. All right, there we go. So now each one of these is available as its own thing. The reason I'm seeing lines here is because it is highlighting the Apple buffer 1. So let's turn that off. And now we can see. So this answers a question right now. You might want to know how many Apple stores are within 10 miles or less of another Apple store. And I could very quickly add this up. Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I could run some queries, or I could just cruise through my map and figure it out. We don't want to do that. So we could just be aware of that. Well, what is the next step? We need to clip this household block data. Now earlier when I talked about copying these to a known location, I could have done it with the census block household data, but it would have been really inconvenient because that's a lot of information, and I'm trying to optimize my steps here. by default of this next process that I will do, it will put my data in a known location. So that's why I kind of waited until now. And honestly, load up your Xbox or your meal or whatever you want to do for about 15 minutes because this will take a little while. I'm going to Geo Process and I'm going to clip. What am I going to clip? That household data by census block. And I'm going to clip it with my Apple buffer dissolve. And once again, give it somewhat of a logical name. Clipped. I'll say clipped send. You're gonna find out like it gets really picky if these names get too long as well. So it'll chirp at you and tell you if something is wrong. Tolerance, we'll just ignore. Hit OK. And go play Grand Theft Auto 5 for about 20 minutes and come back. Or not. If you see something that happens abnormally fast, oops, that's a red flag. So let's close that. I believe what happened was I had something selected. Having things selected means something. So what happened was it only clipped that area that I had selected. Whoops. Well, that's all right. Let's right click and remove that. Hit this guy here, the clear selected features. Just did that. And repeat the steps once more. Here's my buffer dialog input. Well, I'm still clipping the same thing, and make sure you click on the right thing. I'm still, oops, buffer, sorry. I got a little confused there. I want to clip. And I'm clipping the same thing, the census block, and I'm clipping it with the exact same features, my Apple buffer dissolve. And once again, I'll give it a name. I'm going to say clipped. And I know it'll yell at me because if I give it the name of something that already exists, I'll give it another name. That is fine. The only difference here is I don't have anything selected. Okay, last time I lied. This time I promise it will take a while to process. So hopefully you didn't go and play Grand Theft Auto to find out that you did something wrong and it only took 1.5 seconds and you got to repeat all of this. Well, it looks like that only took 8 minutes, not the 20 I was expecting, which that's okay, but not a bad idea to take a look at the data that resulted and make sure it has everything that it should have. So in this situation, I can see all of the attributes. That is good. Let's turn that off and let's zoom to the extents of that one. All right, that looks pretty good. Now earlier I mentioned there's one way to change the styling, and you can do that just by clicking on any style element in your table of contents and changing it. But sometimes you'll notice that data, especially if you find it from this ArcGIS Online, will already be styled and organized in a certain way. Now there is a long way to reproduce that, and you would do it this way. You would right click on that data, go to properties and then symbology, and then rebuild it using categories or quantiles, however it was set up. Or there's a much easier way, and that is to import another symbology. So if I click on import, I can select that same layer there, hit OK, and it's just verifying, hey, which fields do you want to match up? Since that is a derivative of this, it's the exact same field. That looks good, and apply, and OK. There we go. Magically, that has now inherited the same symbology. Maybe you spend a lot of time building the symbology and filling in these names and units and whatnot. You can also do this. You can right click, go to save as layer file, and that will save that symbology if you want to reapply it to similar data. But keep in mind that only works if the attributes are exact or pretty darn close. Only the names can change, but the data still has to mean the same thing. What do we do now? Well, let's turn that off and let's zoom in on an area. So this is extremely helpful. There's still a lot of data to chew on here, but it's reduced considerably because these census blocks, you can look at how much area is not included. You could even get rid of that if you want. So right click and I could remove, but I'm going to keep it on. I actually won't be using it anymore in this video, but maybe you want to repeat this process except use 15 miles instead of 10 or maybe less. So keep in mind, if I were to remove it, I would just need to re-add it and that would be okay as well. All right, so let me turn on my buffered area. I'm going to drag that up just so it's on top of that. And I'll zoom to layer. Well, what's the next thing we need to do? We've got data, these block groups that has a bunch of really good population and demographic and owner occupancy versus renter occupancy data. And I've got another piece of information here that just shows the buffered areas. And I kind of want to join that information. Well, logically, we would use a join. Now, joins and relates, they're used for different things. Technically, a join creates a new table. A relate just temporarily relates to tables and only works with tabular data. A join, you can mix tabular data with spatial data. And that's what we're doing. We're mixing the space represented by my teal-y colored buffered cluster areas to the data that's inside of my clipped households. Now, a good practice that I'd recommend is turn off the attributes that you don't need. It'll just save you from having to look at and crunch in your head too much information. A lot of this data gets generated by default. We're not deleting any of this data, we're just visually turning it off for the time being. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn those off, hit apply, and close that. Do the same thing for this one. Lots of really good data here. If at any time you want to relate this to other census data, you would want to keep all of the FIPS because that's the unique matching key you would need. In this situation, all I'm really concerned about is the population. So I'm going to go to properties and turn all these off. You know what? Do I want to shape? Block FIPS, population. I'll keep that on. You know what? I'm going to keep the households as well and the housing units. We might find something interesting with those. And I'm going to hit apply and close. Now, visually, they're just turned off on this piece of data and respectively for that piece of data. When you apply a Geo Process, the Geo Process result only copies over those things that are visible. So in a really roundabout way, I am deleting all that other data, and in this situation is perfectly fine, keeping in mind the things I mentioned about the FIPS. We want to join, right click, and in a weird way, this is a Geo Process, just accessed a different way because we're generating new data. I'm going to join, and you know what? Let me double check here before I jump into that. I want to make sure that these are all separate, and I can also verify that by just clicking. That's good. I didn't want these to all represent one selection. That would be bad. And now I can right click, joins and relate. I'm going to join. On this data, you've got a couple options. I can join attributes from a table. They don't have to have the same name, but you would need to know what you're joining to what. And you can join data based off of spatial location. That's what we're going to do. What are we going to join? This clipped census data to. And this one, super important. Well, the population is represented by each one of those block points on here. And we want to add all of them up. And this relates to what I was talking about 20 minutes ago about I could use the tract data because that also has population, but it gets a little ambiguous where this overlaps the tracts and how do you divide up the, how do you factor what the population and what percentage, etc. This very conveniently has an option to say, hey, just summarize it. Take that data, add them together. So all of the demographic data is essentially being transferred from those blocks to my buffered designated areas. And where do I want to save this? Geodatabase looks good. And I'm going to say join, let's say for census underscore, buffer. There we go. Hopefully I'll remember that. Once again, take a break and maybe make sure this doesn't crash. Probably should have saved this. This is a little bit more intense of a process. But once again, we're not looking at 6 million plus points. We're still looking at a good deal of points. And ArcGIS has to do a lot of thinking. So be prepared to take a break. That was a process that I believe I was thinking would take longer, and I think I may have messed up again. Did I have that one selected and only that one selected? If I did, that might be a problem. Here's one way I can find out. I'm going to quickly select all of the records that resulted of that join. Oh nope, it looks good. Right click, zoom to layer. It looks like we're in business. That's good news. And if I were to right click, go to the attribute tables once more, notice I now have a sum households and a sum household units. Let's go ahead and sort this. And I can see this one has the most households, that has the highest population. And I bet you, yep, it looks like it's over in New York, over in this area. That gels, it all makes sense. Let's go ahead and take a look at Fargo, how about? Click on that. Well, let's do the info method this time. Population in 10-mile radius of downtown Fargo, 183 people, according to the 2010 census. All right, I think this looks good for the next step, which is we need to factor in Apple stores. How many Apple stores are in each one of these zones? Well, there's a slightly different way. It's kind of the same process, but a slightly different way to set it up. And I'll start by opening up my Apple export, which I have a horrible icon for that. Let's go back to this one. And how about we'll make it red? There we go. And I'm going to drag that up top. And you know what? I'll make it even a little bit smaller. Let's do size 4. All right, so in this cluster right here, I need to create a field that will show me how many Apple stores are within this area. It's 1 o'clock, which apparently is the time to test the sirens. I apologize if you can hear that in the background. I sure can hear it, but I'll do my best, and hopefully you can too, to ignore it. Continuing on, how do we create a field that shows all of these Apple stores in here? Well, there's some tools that will do it for you. There's a handful of ways to do it. This is not the most elegant way, but it works. I need to create another attribute in the Apple Store location, and then I'll need to do a join. So here's how we add that attribute. Just open the attribute table, and you could start an edit session, but a neat thing about adding fields is you don't have to. And if I click on this little pop-out, highlight add field, if that's grayed out, go back to the beginning of this video and I'll explain why, but because I've put this in my Geo database, that's not grayed out. Add field, and let's call this SC for store count. Short integer is fine. Short integer will hold anywhere from positive to negative 32,000. That's important. You'll see why here in a moment. I'll click OK, and it went ahead and created it. Now, each one of these stores equals one store. Why am I doing this? It'll make sense here in a moment. I'm going to right click on that field that I just created and go to Field Calculator. This is where it's kind of neat and not so neat. You don't have to go into an edit session. If you are in an edit session and you mess up, you just don't save your result. This message is telling you, hey, you can do this without an edit session, but you can't go back, so make sure you understand that. I am fine. What is my field calculator? I'm going to say equals 1, and let's see what happens. I might not need that equal sign in there. A failure during process, I think I know what it is. Let's try that one more time. Field calculator, I have SC equals 1, so I just take that away, hit OK, and there we go. Now each one of these Apple stores equals 1. But remember, we created that one proposed Apple store up in Fargo. So let me close this, let me zoom out, and we will change just that one to a 0 for our calculation purposes. Or do we want to keep it? You know what? I'm going to keep it. I'll just have to remember that this particular one is, in fact, a proposed location. Do you know what we could do? We can add another layer or another attribute, not a layer. So I will do that same step I did before, add field, and we'll say POE. How about proposed or existing? And this is going to be, it could be an integer. Let's do text. How about that? Hit OK. And at the very end here, I'll do the same thing. Right click, field calculator. It's important that I set that to be a text. I'll hit yes, and POE equals, in double quotes, existing. It'll crunch that. Now all of them except this one, remember this guy? Let's go ahead and select just that one. And you know what, I'm going to turn off that so it doesn't accidentally select my zone. Find it in your table here, and I can edit just that one. But you know what? You can't edit it. You can only do a field calculator. What's going to happen if I highlight that row, field calculator, and let's make sure it only does that one. Proposed. And my mouse disappeared. That's no good. There it is. And good, it only edited that one. Perfect. So we've adjusted our table. I can close this. I can deselect that because sometimes having things selected will mess stuff up. And let's zoom out and take a little bit of a breather here. What do we do next? We need to add that or join that piece of data to this one here. So just as before, because I don't want that other stuff to come along for the ride, I'm going to turn all of those off except for those last two, store count and proposed or existing. Hit apply and close this. And on this one, let's see what kind of fields we got on count. You know, just for the sake of this presentation, I'll just worry about population right now. But keep in mind, you might want to keep those other ones in case you want to show some other demographic data. But I only want to pass along that attribute. Close this, and as you might guess, we will do another join. This one should not take as long as the last one. It's a spatial join. So join the data from this Apple export, and we will summarize. And we're summarizing store count. How is it going to summarize the text field? You know, I'm not exactly sure, but we'll find out soon enough. What is the name of this? Join output is the default, but let's call, join underscore SC for store count. Hit OK. And ooh, that was much faster. Let's take a look at our attribute table. Ah, nice. So we're not crunching millions of pieces of data. We're just adding one field. And you'll notice that it adds up a few other attributes sometimes. Like I didn't think I had the Latin long turned on, but sometimes it just automatically creates data. I've got my population, which is good. I've got the sum SC, the sum store count, and oh, you know what? It didn't do anything. It just kind of ignored that text data. We're almost towards the end. I'm going to go to the properties for the sake of convenience. Just visually turn off everything but the sum population 2010 and the store count, sum store count. There we go. And let's go ahead, hit apply. Now I talk a lot about making these kind of short cryptic names. You can change those. For example, if I just click and release in my table of contents, I can name this to Apple Store Study Areas and hit enter. That is just an alias, and I should probably capitalize store, so let me do that one more time. There we go. That's just an alias. The actual data is still, if I go to my list by source and scroll over to the side here, I can see that actually it doesn't, but it does have, the data itself has a different name. I thought it was listed here, but it didn't. I bet you we can see it if we go to the properties and go to source. So here I can see that the feature class is called join SC. And if I go to general, I can see the layer name is set to this, which again is an alias. Can you do that with attributes? You know what? I bet you can. Let's find out. Oh, maybe not. Field calculator, properties. There we go. I can give it an alias as well. Stores in zone. Apply. All right. And properties. Let's call this one population. All right, this is starting to make sense. Let's think about what do we want to do next. Well, what kind of argument would you need to make to say that this area could justify, hopefully, having an Apple Store in it? Well, what would be valuable to know is within a 10-mile radius of every Apple Store, how many people are served, and subsequently, how many people per store are served. That's the magic key that will tie all of this together for this short demonstration purpose. And to do that, I will need to create a new field, and we'll call this PPS, people per store. And data types. Here's where data types are important. Short integer will only store between positive and negative 32,000 and change. Well, 32,000, I bet you there's more people than that that are served per store within my 10-mile radius, aka my perceived 15-minute communication path. So I'm going to do long integer because that should store much larger numbers. If you're ever uncertain, you can Google ArcGIS data types, and that should take you to a page, geodatabase field data, and here you can see short integer, there's the figure, long integer, I can go between positive and negative 2 billion. Yeah, so that I think is going to be a safe number, and floating numbers, etc. We can go back. Long integer is good. Let's hit OK. And by default, it's set to null, which once again is not 0. It just means nothing. Just does not exist. Right click, field calculator, and we are going to build a little code here. And all we need to do is say sum population divided by, which is just the slash, and sum store count. Let's go ahead and hit OK. Hopefully we get no errors. There we go. So a lot of these places only have one store. That just is a 1-to-1 ratio. But when we get down here, areas around, I imagine Manhattan, has 22 stores, but only 745,000 people are served in that area. So this starts to make sense why they put a ton of stores in smaller areas. Can we zoom directly to it from here? Yeah, we sure can. Right click zoom. Where are we at? Oh, yep, looks like it's out on the East Coast there. That makes sense. All right, now we're going to find out if our gut feeling is validated or not. Let's go ahead and click on the Fargo area. If you're not sure where that's at, you can always turn on your track boundaries or your base map, or you can just know. If I would have copied over that other attribute saying proposed or existing, I could select it by that. But let's sort this by total population. So in all of these zones, oh, where's Fargo? Look at that, we're not the worst, so that's promising. We're on the edge, we're on the outskirts of what apparently is acceptable demographically for an Apple Store, but look at that, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other stores that have serve a smaller base, and they get an Apple Store, so hey, why not? Let's sort it out by people by store and see what happens. Ooh, even better. So now we're going up a notch. This little piece of information, it seems like a ton of work to get to this, but this is really valuable. This is the selling point. At this point, I could package this up in some nice pretty graphics and hopefully succinctly display and communicate this idea. I've got the data to back it up if I need it, but for the most part, nobody really needs to see that. If they don't believe me, I'll show them, but the data is what provides the framework for this idea. Now I can take this further. I could start calculating maybe average salaries or growth trends. I could go off of projected population growth. Fargo probably has a higher projected population than average for the rest of the nation. And there's all kinds of data that we can now supplement and build on top of this. There is no end. The end really is determined more by the time you have available, not by the ideas that you can bring to this table. So let's close this. we're at the end of the processing step. And from here, I would move into a presentation mode. How do we package this up? How do we visually display this quantitative information very effectively? Well, there are a lot of ways to do it. That is a subject for another video. So I will end with this. If you have any questions, please email me, matthew.chambers@ndsu.edu. Thank you and good luck.